Hi, my name is Ivan Pupoliti, and as the Director of the U.S. Forest Service Office of Innovation and Organizational Learning, one of my responsibilities was to develop a process whereby the Forest Service could focus on learning from events. This process is called the Learning Review. During this talk, I'm going to introduce you a little bit to the Learning Review as part of an organizational transformation that took place that put the U.S. Forest Service on a trajectory away from blame and toward learning. For most of my career, I was an operational pilot. I started out in 1985 with the U.S. Coast Guard, flying Falcon jets and C-130s in all-weather operations, in search and rescue, and in law enforcement. In that 10-year period that I was active duty in the Coast Guard, I lost 2 friends in aviation accidents. So 2 friends in 10 years. After the Coast Guard, I joined the U.S. Forest Service. In my first year in the U.S. Forest Service, I lost 2 friends. Our record is rather abysmal when it comes to accidents. In fact, since 1994, the wildland firefighting community, ground firefighters and aviation firefighters included, have lost over 400 firefighters. That's in line of duty deaths alone. The course of my Forest Service career changed radically when I recognized the rate of fatality, and I became an accident investigator. During this period of time, my path changed, and over the next 10 years, the Forest Service and my path merged in a number of different ways, and together we changed. We started out, like most organizations do, with a simple moniker of failure to follow rules, regulations, policies, and procedures. This is similar to most organizations that strive to reduce accidents through the enforcement of rules, regulations, policies, and procedures. One of the ways that organizations are doing this today, and the Forest Service is not alone, is to create what they call life-saving rules. For the Forest Service, these rules were called the 10 standard firefighting orders and the 18 situations that shout, watch out. Other organizations might know these better as life-saving rules. The rules themselves are questionable, but people were being held to account to these rules. Some of these rules made no sense at all. For example, if we take a look at the standard firefighting order number 10, fight fire aggressively having provided for safety first, what we realize is that there's no way to really know in the moment what is safe enough or what is aggressive enough. In Storm King Mountain, we had a fatality fire where 14 firefighters died in 1994. The conclusion of leadership was that the rules, the 10 and 18, had been violated. And during a briefing after the event, the agency administrators for both the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management together announced that the 10 standard firefighting orders are inviolate. We don't bend them, we don't break them, is what they said. The reality of the situation is that if you asked field personnel if they could follow the 10 and 18 and still accomplish their mission, their answer would be no. We often look at this as a difference between work as imagined and work as performed. But the net underlying problem with this is that distrust began to brew at the field level of the organization. Field began not only to question leadership, but also to question the rules that leadership created. Where people would be normally willing to give information, once the field personnel became distrustful of the circumstances and of the organization, they stopped talking. Fast forward just a little bit to 2001. By this time, the Forest Service has developed what they call the Serious Accident Investigation Process to hold people accountable to the 10 and 18. This happened on the 30 Mile fire in July of 2001 when we lost 4 firefighters in a burnover event. Second victims were created as a result of this. People who were deeply, deeply interested in doing what was best for both the environment, the fire community, and their own communities ended up fighting fire, dying, and then being blamed for their own death. But beyond that, the people who were close to them, their leadership at the forest level, were blamed and held accountable to the 10 and 18. These second victims were being created through the process, and in 30 Mile, one of these second victims was actually brought to trial. The incident commander for the 30 Mile fire was criminally investigated and charged, and the report was used to support the investigation. The field, what they learned from this was to lawyer up, and information became even more scarce. As we started to understand this, we understood that a change was being demanded, because information is, in fact, the lifeblood of safety. It is the currency of safety. The only way that we can move forward and create a safer work environment is to have that information. But if people aren't talking, then nothing's happening. Leadership in the Forest Service was well-intended and wanted to improve our accident rates. And despite all their efforts, things were getting worse. Some key Forest Service leaders were looking for help, and they looked outside the organization, and they attended a leadership program focused on listening and learning. The field claims leaders don't understand the work, and the field was right. And leadership was beginning to understand that they needed to ask better questions. In the meantime, the Serious Accident Investigation Guide was codified, and here's what it said. It said in the second paragraph of the first page of Chapter 1, titled Accident Investigation, the causes of most accidents and incidents are the result of failures to observe established policies, procedures, and controls. While this sounds great, the reality is it gives no context to the actions and decisions of people. Instead, it removes context, and by removing context, it removes our ability to learn from the event. The field recognized this, and they felt that there was an inequity in the process, and they were right. I was given the assignment of being the chief investigator for an accident as this serious accident investigation had been incorporated into the organization. Now, I'm an aircraft investigator by training at this point and qualified by both Navy, Air Force, and by the University of Southern California Aviation Safety Program to conduct aviation accident investigations. But when I arrived on scene at Norcross in 2006, the basic tools that the Forest Service gave me, the Serious Accident Investigation Guide, didn't fit the situation. Norcross demanded a different approach, and we began to see accidents as the unintentional outcome of a network of causality. We started to map this network. We started literally by putting Post-it notes on the wall to map the network that was involved in influencing people to do what they did at Norcross. Rather than causing them, we started to soften the language. And that was the first time that we mapped the network of influences. The network of influences map became a rather important point for us as field investigators, but even more, it became a way for us to communicate with leadership in a way that positioned leadership to deal with the conditions rather than dealing with the people and trying to correct bad behaviors. So rather than focusing on individual failure, the approach to Norcross was centered on why it made sense for people to do the things that they did that in hindsight may have seemed irrational. The first rudimentary network of influences map was created, and it examined the relationship between the way the field was communicating and the way they were developing understanding at the Norcross event. And the report for the first time considered systemic improvements. Now, leadership's response to Norcross was something that I was very concerned about. After almost a year of work on the report itself, I brought it to leadership to the Accident Review Board. There I met Hank Cashton for the very first time. Hank was one of those leaders who had attended that leadership training. I didn't know that at the time, and I was very concerned that the report that I had written was going to be turned back to me and not accepted by the board because it was so radically different. Hank came in, he was running late, he took his jacket off in a flurry, hung it on a coat rack right behind him, sat down at the table with the report in his hand, and threw the report on the table. And I thought, this is it. It's over. I'm going to have to redo the whole damn thing. And instead, Hank looked up at me and began to smile, and he said, I read this last night for the third time, and it is so different. And the one thing that I can tell you is I want more of this. What happened in that moment was a leadership pause to reflect. And this pause to reflect was generated by Hank and was supported by a consultancy that was hired by the Forest Service to help leadership to examine itself. This group of social scientists told leadership in the Forest Service that they didn't listen and therefore they didn't learn. So leadership was put in a position where they began to become sensitive to the importance of learning, and that created a space for the development of the Learning Review. The Learning Review officially replaced the Serious Accident Investigation Guide in 2013. It now includes the Network of Influences map, and it also includes a couple of other very key aspects of understanding about how we can learn better in an organization. One of those key bits of understanding is we include the people who were involved in the incident and also the workforce in understanding the event through focus groups. We also enjoin the workforce and middle leadership and senior leadership in the co-creation of recommendations to try and mitigate further accidents in the future. There were a number of successes that we didn't expect as a result of the learning review. For example, our Occupational Safety and Health Administration had a tendency to, well, there wasn't a tendency, they flat out violated us every single time we had an accident for failure to follow the General Duty Clause. The General Duty Clause reads that it's the employer's responsibility to create a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious harm to employees. Well, when you think about what firefighters do, especially wildland firefighters, we go into the hazard. We're paid to go into the hazard. How do we create a workplace free from known hazard? The other thing that emerged out of this, though, is we enjoined OSHA in the learning review process. We brought them on board early in the process and let them see what we were trying to do. They began to understand what our principles were. One of those principles was to do no further harm to the organization, the system, or the people within the system. When OSHA started to realize that our principles aligned with their principles, they saw that we were working toward the same goal, and we stopped getting violated for the General Duty Clause. Since we've employed the learning review, we have not gotten a single OSHA violation. The other thing that we do that's quite different is we involve the families in the process. So when the report is completed, before it's released to the public, we sit down with the families and we go over the report page by page. We ensure that the families see that their loved one didn't die in vain and that some good would come out of this terrible event. Since we've employed the learning review and brought the families in on these discussions and let them be part of this process, we haven't been sued by a single family. Prior to this point, we were sued nearly every time we had an event. So basically, in a nutshell, the transformation that was taking place inside the Forest Service was as the result of leadership reflecting on its own presence and its own ability to lead and what it wanted to lead, the field moving to a place of greater understanding, and understanding that they needed to learn as well, so that it was a co-creation of safety that was happening. And to put it all together in a phrase, the organization as a whole was learning how to learn. And on top of that, learning was beginning to trump all other goals. In order to create a safer workplace, we had to have that information. We had to enjoin with the workforce. And we had lost touch with the full meaning of justice. Simply reduced it to holding people accountable after the event. The new Forest Service approach, supported by the Chief of the Forest Service, was to focus on learning. And in fact, the Chief equated learning with accountability, thereby revitalizing a sense of justness in the organization.